Years ago this month, we were all faced with illness and quarantine and lockdown and disruption as we grappled with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. I clearly remember taking my son Max, who was 6 at the time, to a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden on March 2nd, 2020. And on our commute into Manhattan together, we casually chatted about this faraway fear of a global pandemic and what might happen if it arrived in our city. But it was a very theoretical fear as we sat in our seats surrounded by thousands of other unmasked spectators. Little did we know that Max's school would be the very first school in the Northeast to close the very next morning. And as a parent at his school was hospitalized with COVID. There was a Fordham connection too, as the chaplain caring for this patient in the hospital was married to one of our graduate students, who then found herself also in quarantine. And then within hours, everyone we knew was in a panic. Though our family and our community was already in pandemic times, it would take another 10 days for the rest of the city, including Fordham, to get caught up, and the rest is history. Almost as soon as the pandemic began, so did archiving practices about it. There was a sense at the time, if I'm recalling correctly, that the pandemic of 1918 had been forgotten, and that if only we had had a better historical sense of that pandemic, we might have been able to avert this one. That was the sense at the time. And so libraries and museums and universities around the world, including Fordham, began asking right away for citizens to document their experiences and to send photos and reflections and documents to local institutions for archiving. Scholars and religious practitioners too joined those efforts to process the pandemic in real time, not only to mourn those so tragically who died and to care for those who found themselves most vulnerable, but also to process the changing world and what it meant for us as individuals and as communities in both the short and the long term. Fordham Center for Jewish Studies held a series of online panels and workshops on the history of pandemics in Jewish history, for example. And one way of coping with the present, it seemed, was to commune with other communities of the past who found themselves in similar circumstances. Among, I think, the most important works of scholarship in Jewish studies produced during that period was Rabbi Dr. Erin Leib Smokler's book, Torah in a Time of Plague, which brings together almost 24 scholars, teachers, and theologians to reflect on the pandemic from different disciplinary, historical, and literary perspectives, and has, since its publication, received the National Jewish Book Award in recognition of its achievement in this field. So as we mark the pandemic's 3-year anniversary this month, I'm moved to welcome both Erin and her brother, Ethan Leib, who contributed to the volume and who teaches here at the Fordham Law School, to speak about the book and to carry the learning forward in new ways. I will in a moment introduce Erin and Ethan, but I first want to extend a few words of gratitude. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with Fordham Law School and Fordham's Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work. And I thank our partners at the law school, especially Russell Pierce and Andy Moraes, for their continued collaboration with us. I also want to extend a thank you to Magda Tedder, my co-director at the Center for Jewish Studies, and Siobhan Berleza, our administrator, who both worked tirelessly on behalf of the center, to Fordham's special events team, and our program sponsors, especially Henry Miller, Eileen Schuler, Dario Wertheim, the Knapp Family Foundation, and Charlie Knapp, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Schvidler, Bruce Terrigan, and members of our advisory council, whose generosity allows us to do all of the work that we do. I now have the honor of introducing our speakers. Dr. Rabbi Erin Leib Smokler is the Director of Spiritual Development and Publications Editor at Yeshivat Maharat, where she teaches Chassidism and Pastoral Torah. She's also a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. She earned both her PhD and MA from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought and her BA from Harvard University. She was ordained by Yeshivat Maharat. Erin previously served as assistant literary editor at the New Republic magazine, And her writing has appeared there as well as in the New York Times Book Review, the Jewish Week, and other publications. And she edited the book at the heart of today's conversation. Erin Leib is professor of law at Fordham Law School. He teaches in contracts, legislation, and regulation. His most recent book, Friend versus Friend, Friendships and What, If Anything, the Law Should Do About Them, published by Oxford University Press, explores the costs and benefits of the legal recognition of and sensitivity to friendship. Ethan's scholarly articles have appeared in many publications. I'm not going to list them all here. And he's also written for broader audiences in the New York Times, USA Today, Policy Review, and others. Before joining Fordham, Ethan was a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings in San Francisco, and he has served as a law clerk to then Chief Judge John Walker Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and as a litigation associate as well. So welcome and thank you. And I leave the rest to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, Emily, friends, students. It's really a joy. Dr. Ton Gribbets, is that how we go? Did a wonderful introduction to the book, and I'm going to add just a little bit to tell you about the project, and then to offer something of an update, if you will, or a view from 3 years later. So, as was said, this book began really as an attempt on a personal level to process the world as it was coming undone, and also to serve as a kind of archive. My own previous academic interests were in a certain rabbi whose name is Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapira, who himself archived in real time his own understandings of the Holocaust from within the Warsaw Ghetto. That is what I wrote my dissertation on. And so the idea of documenting in real time was something that felt very, very important and urgent to me. And so with some help, I collected friends and mentors and thinkers who I wanted to hear from and asked to reflect on the current moment. And the result was and is this book, Torah in a Time of Plague. It is divided into a bunch of different areas: theology of plague, Jewish community and practice under duress, history and literature of plague, quarantine reflections, one of them written by Professor Ethan J. Leib, and time, reflections on time in unprecedented times. So through the varied lenses of Jewish philosophy, literature, history, and law, we tried to find ways to anchor ourselves during our moment at sea. So as we reflect 3 years on, of course, we're not completely out of the woods, but we are far along in this journey in a new direction. And so I too want to use the language of Jewish philosophy and Jewish literature to think about how we might anchor ourselves. A word that captured the feeling of the pandemic for many was hefker, a Hebrew and Yiddish word which signifies chaos, disorder, and unpredictability. When things are hefker, they are, simply put, a mess. They are up in the air and all over the place. Anything goes because nothing is set. And a world that is characterized by such instability, as my mother likes to say, is hefkerwelt. For many of us, this period was one of great disorientation as the structures of our lives came undone. Everything whirled: our relationships, our jobs, our sense of safety and mobility. We felt a certain kind of dizziness, both physical and existential. Interestingly, though, the Jewish tradition does not look at hefkerut, hefker, with dread alone. And on the contrary, there are threads of the tradition that see in it something else: possibility and radical openness. Indeed, according to the Midrash, it is the very precondition for the Torah, or maybe life and wisdom itself. Like that. Okay. So Bamidbar Rabbah 1:7 states, Kol she'eino oseh atzmo kamidbar hefker, eino yachol liknot et hachokma vehatorah, which means anyone who does not make themselves ownerless like the wilderness cannot acquire the wisdom and the Torah. Therefore, it says the Sinai wilderness. I'll leave aside the kind of literary prompt for that. But the Torah here needed to be given in and to unfold in the context of a midbar or wilderness, because Torah or wisdom rest on the experience of hefkerut that only a desert can so palpably deliver. So what is hefkerut here? Again, the very opposite of tidy order, ownerlessness and unruliness, and it is radical openness, uncontrolled and untamed. It is total vulnerability, exposed and raw. Being in the desert with its vast expanses, blazing sun, magnificent quiet, and timeless landscapes generates all of these experiences. In the midst of unending sands, one can feel one's smallness bump up against the grandeur of eternity. In that space, one might become uncannily receptive. One might begin to hear the voice of the divine. So render yourself hefker, says this midrash, in order to receive wisdom. Open yourself widely, detach yourself from those things that tether you and tame you. Give yourself over to the wildness, for you just might find your way back to Sinai. The path to order is paved through disorder. This is one way that we might reframe that mess, that hefker of the pandemic 3 years on. We cannot undo the loss of life and the loss of ways of life, but we might consider the ways that the profound destabilization and dislocation served as a wilderness that opened us up in a myriad of ways, made us see things about ourselves and our world that we might have been blind to before, made us contend with with realities glorious and horrid that we might have missed. It shocked us out of our staid routines and maybe, just maybe, gave us openings to alternatives. One more thought about hefkerut. In the Hasidic tradition, the concept gained yet another valence. Since tonight is, in some small sense, a celebration of Leibs, I bring you another of no relation whatsoever, Rabbi Yehuda Leib of Gur, the Sfat Emet. In 1874, he wrote, and I will read this only in English, the Torah represents the wholeness of created beings, and to the degree that they are lacking in their own eyes, they will yearn for that wholeness. It's very hard for agentic beings to see themselves as deficient, as we must. But one who makes themselves like a desert gains this insight. As it says in the Midrash, one cannot merit Torah without first becoming hefker like the desert. This was the preparation of the Israelites before they received the Torah, that they arrived at this attribute of desertness, that it became clear to them that they needed to yearn for wholeness and to clarify this need for others. On this read, the desert experience is one of thirst, of recognizing that we do not contain within ourselves all that we need to survive and to thrive. It highlights our dependence, our need to look outward and maybe upward to complete ourselves. Becoming hefker here is becoming aware of this essential human insufficiency. For the Sfat Emet, this awareness is an elemental part of spiritual life, which is a striving toward wholeness. It all begins with desire. In order to arrive at wholeness, one must recognize that one is not yet whole. In order to get filled up, one must behold the ways in which one is ridden with holes. The Torah for him offers a path toward that completeness, but it can be received only by those who can see how very incomplete they are. This is what the wilderness or the midbar was all about. Becoming conscious of thirst, so that it might be quenched by the waters of wisdom. The path might be long, 40 years long, in fact, and quite circuitous. But this is what it takes, liknot et hachokma ve'et haTorah, he says, to actively acquire wisdom and Torah. So here lies one more way of making meaning of the mess with the gift of some time. The distancing of the pandemic made us all so very conscious of our dependence, on whom we depend, on what we depend. We learned in our bodies how utterly reliant we are on one another to protect our safety. And we learned in our hearts, perhaps, how profoundly we need one another. We felt vulnerable, deeply aware of our own insufficiencies. We got in touch with our existential thirst in the desert of Corona. Maybe, just maybe, we got some intimations of who or what quenched that. So living in a hefkerut no doubt left some of us lost in the wilderness. But the Midrash and the Sfat Emet invite us to embrace some ways that through hefker, we might find our ways back home. I will now turn things over to Professor Erin Leib to offer his perspectives as a legal scholar on the meanings of hefkerut.
So that is, I mean, it's very inspirational point of access hefker, but the kind of operationalized idea that most kind of practicing Jews are use it for is kind of happening right in the next few weeks. As we approach it, I can remember being out in the wilderness, and one of the kind of rituals that people engage in right before Passover starts is they often have their kids run around looking for a few pieces of bread that the parents have kind of set around the house, and they sweep them into a paper bag. And then they say a prayer, and then the next morning they burn this bag and say the prayer over again. And I just thought I would have us take a look very briefly at that prayer. So that's source 2 on your source sheet if you have it accessible. Does anyone want to read us the source in English? Clem Schoenfeld.
All chametz and leaven in my possession that I have not seen and or have not eliminated shall be nullified and become ownerless, like the dust of the earth.
Good. So you see that word ownerless there. That's the sort of operationalization of the concept of hefker that you just heard about. This is probably, though, other than if your mother talks about hefkerut, this is the one time a year you actually make a declaration of something to become ownerless. And I wanted to just observe a few things about it. One kind of observation you might have is, can this really be effectuated legally by merely making a declaration? As you simply say it out loud and it is sufficient? Or is there something else, some kind of action you have to take? Is there something about the burning that happens the next day that in some sense, makes it real that it's now ownerless? So that's one kind of question. Another kind of question, though, is imagine, especially in this world of being in pandemic, you might have had to do this alone. So if you made this declaration alone, should that be legally effective? If literally no one heard you make that declaration. If you say it in a forest, then no one hears it. Is it an effective declaration of ownerlessness? The other kind of question to ask yourself is, how seriously are you even taking it? So suppose you did in fact have the intent to make it ownerless, but then you recognize that, suppose the following thing happens, you declare it ownerless, then you go to synagogue the next day, you come back to your house and somebody has ransacked it and taken all of your alcohol that you have just declared ownerless in your house. Are you not calling the cops because you have made the declaration? Probably not. You probably think that in fact, your declaration was meant to be symbolic, not meaningful. The problem with the conception in that way is that there really is a very strict prohibition to rid yourself of all of these leavened products. And yet we are allowing a kind of declaration to serve in the role of eliminating and nullifying. And the Bible takes it pretty seriously. So there's only a few kinds of things you can do wrong where God is literally going to smite you and make your days short. And this is one of them, if you have leavened products over the course of the holiday. And yet we seem to be allowing a nullification through a mere speech act that is largely symbolic and ritualistic. In fact, sometimes Jews will simply put a piece of masking tape over their cabinetry and then take off to Florida and lock their door. So in what sense are you really making the things inside ownerless? Do you have a question in the back?
Is not the whole holiday symbolic and ritualistic though?
Yeah, certainly. Great question. That's Shalev, son of Erin. I mean, one might just say the whole religion is caught up in tons of ritualized types of commands. But what's interesting in part is I don't think anyone would say that the Bible itself doesn't prescribe that you celebrate Passover. But this particular declaration, if you take a look at it in the sort of the Hebrew letters, it might look a little strange to you because it's not actually Hebrew. There's some indication that this idea of hefker is coming at us kind of indirectly and not necessarily directly through biblical exegesis. Why don't we move to source 3? Someone want to read it for us? What I'm offering you in source 3 is a little bit of background about the way the common law treats abandonment or ownerlessness in secular law, so that you have some sense of the way in which this developed in non-Jewish traditions. I mean, you'll find it interesting, I hope, because much of this is after. Yes, please.
As for the law of abandonment, the standard rule is deceptively simple. Chattels may be freely abandoned. A chattel will be deemed abandoned when the owner intentionally and voluntarily relinquishes all right, title, and interest in it. Abandoned property returns to the commons. It is obviously difficult to determine with any certainty what is going on inside an owner's head. As a behavioral matter, however, the intention to abandon is typically accompanied by observable acts that evince that underlying desire to sever a claim of ownership, serving an evidentiary or solemnizing role, much like it does within the law of gifts.
I just will pause there. I just make 2 observations. One, there seems to be some kind of connection between the law of gifts and the law of making something ownerless or abandoning it. We'll come back to that and see how the Jewish tradition deals with that issue. Secondarily, notice, and this is, a much later innovation in the secular law, there seems to be some ritualization that has to occur when you make the declaration, right? So as we think about Jewish practice, we are in fact burning it. We're not actually just saying it. The declaration is not effective alone. It's combined with some outward manifestation. We're burning something, even if we're not actually pouring our liquor down the drain. We're burning some bread to evidence that we're serious about severing ties of ownership. Next paragraph.
Active abandonment must not vest ownership of the abandoned object in any specific person. The intention required for abandonment is one in which the owner disclaims any further rights over the object, including the right to determine the property's subsequent owner. Taking affirmative steps to direct the property towards another individual undercuts the claim that the putative abandoner has the requisite unconditional intention to abandon rather than the more conditional intention to convey the object only to a particular person or class of people.
Perfect. Again, we're going to see this come up within Jewish law, so it's worth just putting a pin in this. It is essential to an act of abandonment that you not be directive in that declaration. So I can't, it seems here, say I want to declare this ownerless, but in fact intend for it to go to Magda. Okay, last paragraph.
Seemingly elegant doctrine of abandonment becomes significantly more complicated when interests concerning land are brought into the picture. More starkly, the common law flatly prohibits the legal abandonment of the possessory interest in land. A landowner who wants to sever his ties to the land must find a willing recipient of title, someone to whom he can either sell or give the parcel.
Okay, so now we see that there actually is a distinction that's drawn in secular law as between chattel property on the one hand and landed property on the other. The idea being that with chattel property, you can freely get rid of it. But with landed property, there's a clear proscription on anything but conveyance. So we might ask, why would the common law have come up with that particular idea? Anyone have any thoughts about that? Why might we want people to freely be able to give away pens, but not their apartments or homes?
There's an attachment generationally, perhaps.
Okay, good. So we see a couple of things about that. One, it seems like land is really important to families. And so we might care a lot about wanting people to take a beat and maybe not even be permitted to giving away something. And then something else embedded in my mother's thought there is that something about our status is connected to land in a significant way. And we might be very interested in sustaining the social hierarchy. And if you could freely abandon land, it might actually disrupt the stability of social hierarchy. So that's a thought. Yeah.
About the abandonment of land. I mean, like, or like the return of land, like that seems to be,
No, this is secular law. Yeah. Good. No, so we'll have to come and see whether these ideas that are emerging from the common law, say 1100 and beyond, had anything to do with the way the Jews thought about it before then. Okay? Yeah. Other
It's
thoughts?
easier to pick up a pen than it is a piece of land.
Good. So it might just be something related to efficiency, right? There may be something else going on. And the author of this particular article, Eduardo, used to teach at Fordham Law School, so I thought it was kind of fun to include him. But the argument of this article actually is that part of the reason why we make it hard to get rid of land is actually to make it hard to get rid of the pen. So how might that be? I mean, if anyone's ever moved and tried to get rid of their stuff, how much did you have to pay to remove your stuff from your house? A lot of money, right? It's not so easy to actually get rid of stuff because it turns out if all land is owned, you can't just dump it somewhere. Right? If you leave it on the corner, you might be littering. You might need to pay 1-800 junk, got junk to get rid of your stuff. Okay. And so that there's something, actually, the idea of freely abandoning is already, notice what the title of the article is, the illusory right to abandon. The thinking is, sure, I guess I can throw away my pen, but as you start accumulating bigger and bigger things, it gets harder and harder because there is no free land out there to just dump things on because we don't let people abandon their lands. Okay, so let's move to source 4. And part of what, just to tee up what source 4 is, I mean, although Erin gave you material from the Midrash is being written post-temple or second temple period, more or less. Sure. Okay, so the thinking is, when exactly does this emerge? We have some early sources that give us some indication about the concept of hefker. Okay, so let's look at source 4 together. Are we up? Do you want to say?
It's just that
You want to make a correction?
rabbis early
Okay,
Thank you.
good. That's even better.
historian.
No, very good. Even better for my purposes, because part of what I want to suggest is that the concept of hefker is happening relatively late in the development of sort of biblical thinking. And there's actually a real question as to where does the idea of hefker even come from, right? And so one of the first sources we're going to take a look at here is source 4. This is the Palestinian Talmud's introduction to ownerlessness as part of a Mishnah called Peah. Peah was a practice in which Jews were required, this is a biblical command, were required to leave a corner of their land free, right? And so let's take a look at, why don't, Sarit, you walk us through source 4.
The house of Shammai say, property abandoned to the poor is abandoned, but the house of Hillel say it is not abandoned unless it is abandoned also to the rich, as in a sabbatical year.
Good. Okay, so what you can see here already is 2 schools of thought developing, and 2 schools of thought are identifying different sources for where ownerlessness actually comes from in biblical sources. And there's a debate, and it's not resolved. And one of the schools, the school of Shammai, is saying, if you declare something ownerless just to poor people, that counts as ownerlessness. You are successful in making it ownerless. Notice how that sits in tension with what we just saw about the common law. The common law says if you are directive in your declaration, you haven't abandoned it at all. Shammai's position is it's fine. And it's fine in part because of where he roots the idea of hefker. He roots it in this idea coming from Peah, that there's some corner of your property that you're supposed to allow poor people to be able to harvest if they wish. By contrast, Beit Hillel, those from the school of Beit Hillel say, nope, it is not ownerless unless you are also making it ownerless for rich people too, i.e., I agree with Eduardo that it's not actually abandonment unless it's abandonment for all. Okay, so that is rooted in a biblical idea of the sabbatical year. So notice they have 2 different derivations. The word hefker doesn't appear. This, as you might, if you know the Hebrew, you can see here you have a vet. It's different than the one in the Aramaic, which has a phe. They're interchangeable in some respects, but the point is that there's actually a debate about what even the source of the word is and where it comes from, and it is not resolved. The Palestinian Talmud doesn't say we hold like Hillel, even though those of you that know something about rabbinics probably were like, well, if I have to default, I'm going to default to Hillel. We don't always, there's a set of cases, maybe we think about Shammai. And so why don't we take a look at what the Babylonian Talmud does. The Babylonian Talmud is largely the source of our current laws, and let's see what they did with some of the original sources. Quite, you might think strangely, the appearance of ownerlessness does not come about in discussions about the land because the Babylonian Talmud doesn't have tractates on all of these things related to the land because they weren't in Israel and they didn't care about these things in quite the same way. So the real discussion of ownerlessness, somewhat surprisingly, arises in the context of vows. Okay, so that takes us to source 5. Who's going to walk us through source 5? Mom?
Okay.
Good.
If one took a vow prohibiting himself from benefiting his friend, and the two individuals were walking along the road, and his friend had nothing to eat, the one who vowed from rendering benefit should give his food to a third person as a gift. It is then permitted for the friend to eat the food. If there is no other person with them, the one who vowed places the food on the nearest rock or on the nearest fence and says, "These food items are hereby rendered ownerless and are available to anyone who wants them." Then the friend can take and eat the food. But
Yeah, finish it up.
Rabbi Yosef dissents.
Very good. Okay, so let's pause.
Dissents means he doesn't agree.
Dissents means he doesn't agree. Yes. So, and this is from a Mishnah, okay? And you're being reported 2 separate cases, 2 adjudications. One is you have a situation where you have 2 people, I have taken a vow not to benefit Erin, okay? And if we're walking along the road and Erin is hungry and I have food, the first case is I can give a gift to my mother. Erin's thirsty. I can give a bottle of water to my mother. She can take possession of it, and then she can give it to Erin, and Erin is permitted to drink. Okay, so that's case 1. That's we'll call that, case 1 is the gift case. Okay, the law of gifts, if you will. Okay, then case 2 looks a little different, right? This is your ownerlessness case, or what we're calling the hefker case. The language in the Hebrew uses the root of hefker. Okay, so you have 2 different cases, and it looks like the collator of the Mishnah permits both cases to be ways in which Erin can actually take. So first case is I give to my mother, she takes possession of the water bottle, then as a gift, then gives it to Erin. Okay, and Erin can drink. That's what the Mishnah holds. Second case is I can take the water bottle, I can put it on a rock or on a fence and just say, I declare it ownerless. And Erin may take it and drink from it. That seems to be the ruling. That's the case 2. Okay, so you've got 2 cases, the law of gifts and the law of abandonment together. Okay, so Eduardo did not study any Talmud, but intuited the common law that these cases are connected in some important way. Okay, now we get the dissenting opinion. Also, the Mishnah records not only the 2 cases, but then also tells us Rabbi Yossi dissents. Well, what does he dissent from? What do you think? What are your 2 choices here? Lawyer in the back?
Well, either thinks that both are impermissible ways of getting out from under the vow that you took.
Good. Okay, so both, one possibility is that the dissent is from both cases. These are both lame. Why? Because I'm basically benefiting Erin with the water bottle, and we know that these legal fictions are garbage. And so Rabbi Yossi says, I don't like garbage. Okay, so that's one possibility. What's another possibility?
Second one is that one of these possibilities is in fact a way out from the vow that you've taken not to benefit your friend.
And which one would you say?
Well, it probably is the one in which you are abandoning rather than gifting the food item.
Okay, good. So we might distinguish the cases. One, we might say, I mean, one might have a sort of statutory interpretation type of argument here that it's the last antecedent. That is that the descent seems closest in time to the ownerlessness one, and therefore probably the descent is only on case 2, right? That's possible. It could be on both. Maybe even there's a kind of jumble in the Mishnah and it was really just case 1 and there's something even more offensive about the gift, but that's harder to specify. We'll think about that, right? And notice it kind of matters whether you hold by Shammai or Hillel. Yes, you have a question.
Hebrew says oseh, which really means prohibits, which indicates, I think, that he prohibits both. Meaning, it's not that he disagrees with the opinion, it's that he says that it's prohibited. I don't know if that fits in, but
No, it might. I mean, but you think that conduces to the story that he actually prohibits both.
maybe it's just a note on the translation that like he prohibits, but I think there's a reasonable way of reading it that he prohibits both.
Okay, good. So not,
There's a question in
oh, we got a chat.
about the spelling, why there is a hefker with a bet and in the source 4 versus te in source 1. I assume it's Aramaic. Right?
Yeah, it's the Palestinian versus the Babylonians. The Babylonians used the Fe, and then when we say the declaration before Passover, we say it in the Aramaic and with the Fe. But there's some interesting articles about the swap of the Vet and the Fe online. But I want to stay on track because we're going to run out of time. And I just want to note that what the Gemara takes up or the Talmud takes up right away is not what does the main ruling here, what is it about? What's the reasoning? What's their justification? Who do they hold by? Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel? Instead, what are they fascinated by? What the hell's going on with Rabbi Yossi? That's the first question they ask, okay? And so let's look at that first comment that the Gemara brings us. Hartman, read it.
Rabbi Yochanan said,
Oh, okay, go ahead.
You're doing this.
I just said,
Oh,
Go ahead. Rabbi Yochanan said.
what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi? He holds that the legal status of the process of rendering property ownerless is like that of the acquisition of a gift. Just as acquisition of a gift is not complete until the item comes from the possession of the one who gives the gift into the possession of the one who receives the gift, so too the process of rendering property ownerless is not complete until the item comes into the possession of the one who acquired it.
Okay, so let's think about this. What it looks like is that Yochanan, who's providing the rationale for Rabbi Yossi, thinks that Yossi only has a problem with case 2. It looks like what is going on is the justification for Rabbi Yossi that the Gemara is looking for is only on the dissent for case 2. And what is the story? Well, the story is that the cases are in fact linked, but they're linked in this important way, which is that just like with a gift, the water bottle goes to my mother and then it goes to my sister. So too with hefker, the only way I get rid of the bottle for good, the way I sever my tie to the bottle is when Erin actually takes possessory interest in it, which means that I have violated my vow. This declaration of ownerlessness, according to Rabbi Yochanan's view about Rabbi Yossi, is that this only works like a gift. And so when I declare this ownerless and then Erin goes ahead and drinks it, I have benefited her and I have violated my oath. And that's what's going on with Rabbi Yossi. Now, this view would be a problem for the average Jew trying to abide by the Passover rules, because if I make a declaration of ownerlessness and it's actually not ownerless until somebody else takes possession, I haven't actually rendered it ownerless. But this is a very troubling idea if this is genuinely the reasoning of Rabbi Yossi, okay? Because we would be subject to substantial punishment if we were not actually nullifying and abandoning all of our leavened products prior to Passover. For this reason, the Gemara is not terribly thrilled with this explanation of what Rabbi Yossi is up to. And so we get a second one. This is source 6. Okay, anyone want to take us through 6 very quickly? Beginning, Hoffman.
Rather, Rabbi said that this is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. He is ruling in accordance with a rabbinical decree into the gift of faith.
Okay, we do not know what Rava thinks Yossi was up to vis-a-vis whether it's an objection to the gift case or the ownerlessness case, but we do know the word gift appears. He explains Rabbi Yossi's objection because of something to do with the gift of Beit Horon, which it turns out you have to turn 5 pages forward in the Gemara to figure out what is going on. Okay, and so let's fast forward and head to Nedarim 48a, where we get the explanation of what this event in Beit Horon was.
An incident occurred involving someone in the city of Beit Horon whose father had vowed not to derive benefit from him. The son was marrying off his own son and wanted his father to be able to participate in the wedding meal. The son therefore said to his, the courtyard where the wedding will take place, the wedding meal are given before you as a gift. Order that my father will come and eat with us.
Keep moving.
Recipient said, they are mine. They are all hereby consecrated to heaven. Son said to him in anger, and did I give you my property so that you could consecrate it to heaven? He, the recipient, said to the son, you gave me your property only so that you and your father would eat and drink and thereby appease each other, and the sin of transgressing your father's vow would be hung on my head, as I enabled the transgression. Sages therefore said, any gift is not so absolute, so that if the recipient were to consecrate the gift, it would be consecrated. It's not a gift.
Good. So how do you read this? So now we remember the way we got here is Rava's telling us about Rabbi Yossi's dissent. And we couldn't figure out what is Rabbi Yossi actually dissenting to or prohibiting. Is it case 1 or case 2? And now Rava's saying it's about something about a shady gift that was given in Beit Horon. And now we're being told about what that story is. So what do we squeeze out of this? Hoffman? Hoffman's my study partner, so I can always rely on
Now
Hoffman.
I'm nervous.
No,
If
you
in
know
the first answer, if in the first answer, it was just number 2 that they were objecting to, I might say that this response is much more comprehensive. I don't like whole thing smells because I don't like this. What was the word? The English word that you?
artifice.
Artifice.
Good.
The artifice of getting around what really my intention.
Good. So one way to read Rava's version of Rabbi Yossi's dissent is to say all artifices that seem shady are bad news, they're invalid, and I am basically benefiting Erin. They should be proscribed. If you took a vow not to benefit your sister, you got to live with that vow. None of this shady stuff of giving it to your mother, none of this shady stuff of, putting it on a rock and saying it's ownerless. It looks like it could be both cases. Interesting. Okay. Now, the problem, it seems, for that view, though, is how do we rehabilitate the core majority of position of the Mishnah then? Notice what it says here. Hoffman read it beautifully. It's right at the end. The sages therefore said, any gift that is not so absolute so that if the recipient were to consecrate the gift, it would be consecrated, is not a gift. So looks like artifices are bad, the sages said. So how could it be that 5 pages earlier, the sages seem to say, gifts are fine and ownerlessness is fine? How do we reconcile that?
The earlier one seems to be saying that it's a good gift.
Good. Okay, so good.
It's by it's the hypothetical is by definition, it's an effective gift. In the case that it's an effective gift, the possession has been severed. There's no a quid pro quo where you're saying, I'm giving it to you, and then you could give it along to Erin.
Good. So the majority position seems to be, if I genuinely give the water bottle to my mother and she consecrates it to God, because that's how religious she is, there's nothing I can do about it. It was an absolute gift. The problem of the gift of Beit Charon was that there was an explicit conditionality to the gift giving. But then we have to ask, why is Rabbi Yossi still engaged in prohibiting? And maybe what we would say, counter to Hartman, is actually the gift turns out to be fine. The gift of Beit Charon, the problem is the artifice was so obvious, right? If I do the ownerlessness and there's no one else there, remember the case is precisely that there's no other person present. So this ownerlessness stuff is a joke. There's no one around, right? One might ask, well, what do we do about Passover? We're out in the wilderness and no one else is around and we're not even serious. Are all of those like gifts of Beit Charon? Is that what Rabbi Yossi would say? Okay, good question. We'll leave it open there. Let's look at source 7. Okay. This is another Eidic source about the idea of ownerlessness and gives us another kind of rooting to understand what ownerlessness is about as a legal concept. Okay. Source 7, anyone? Yes, great.
It is taught in a Baraita in the case of one who declares his field ownerless for the entire 3 days after that declaration, he is able to retract it. From this point forward, he is unable to retract the declaration.
Whoa, wait a minute. So look at what it seems to be saying. For 3 days, you can retract your ownerlessness declarations. And then you might ask, what is the status of the field during the time, right? This is you have declared your field ownerless, and then for 3 days, I'm allowed to retract it. So it almost seems like legally it's still mine. I haven't actually severed ties, or at least that's possible. And that seems like some difficulty. Let's look at the rationale right below it, which is what the rabbi supplied to explain this particular 3-day waiting period rule.
Rabbah said, the reason that the sages did not render the item ownerless from the first day is due to the swindlers who declared the field ownerless in order to render the produce of the field exempt from the requirements of tithing, and then retract that declaration and immediately reclaim the field. Therefore, the sages instituted that ownerless status takes effect only after 3 days.
Okay, so what do we see here? We see a concern again about using ownerlessness to get around other kinds of obligations. This may be a background fact you need to know, which is you don't actually have to pay your tithes on things that you've declared ownerless, even if you ultimately reacquire the property. So to disrupt the use of ownerlessness for game playing, the rabbis institute a waiting period such that ownerlessness doesn't accrue right away. But that's very strange for our situation in a few days from now, because it seems to be that the 3-day waiting period, if it applies to our leavened products, we haven't actually severed a tie to it until 3 days after Passover has started, and we are now in violation of the proscription of having the leavened products on Passover. So that's a problem. We could say two things. One thing might be, maybe we should be doing a ritual declaration 3 days previous, not revoke that declaration, and then it's genuinely ownerless, legally speaking, under the Braita. Or what did we learn earlier?
And it's different.
Land is different. Very good. Another lawyer, right? So the idea may be that landed property is different. It means the waiting period. It was the thing that they worried about with tithes. You don't pay tithes on the booze that you have in your cabinet. Okay, so that might solve the problem. Next to last source. I'm going to try to get you out by 7:30, or at least open up for questions by then. Source 8 is the more general ambivalence about artifices from the rabbis. I'll read it for ease. This is Rav Ashi, a later Amora or Talmudic sage. Rav Ashi says, you speak of a case of artifice. A case of artifice is different. The sages were more stringent with regard to one who employs artifice than with regard to the one who intentionally breaks the law. One who purposefully transgresses is aware of his sin, Therefore, he might repent and desist from his prohibited behavior, thereby preventing others from learning from his actions. However, one who employs artifice to circumvent a prohibition thinks that he is acting in a permitted manner. He is therefore likely to continue this practice. Furthermore, people might emulate him, and the halacha or the Jewish law might be forgotten. Okay, so we have a kind of core source here that actually the rabbis were very, very worried about artifices. So now we should go back to Rabbi Yossi's problem, devours artifices, right? My vow not to benefit Erin, and using a variety of artifices that in the end, it is true, the rabbis permitted. But what we might say is, why did they preserve the Rabbi Yossi dissenting opinion? Even though we're not totally sure exactly what the rationale was, the Gemara leaves it as it's about this Beit Choron gift, which, by the way, doesn't resolve our problem here about whether all of these artifices should be undermined. But I think it's a kind of window into a concern that the rabbis continue to have about these artifices, and they wanted to preserve the dissenting opinion, because they wanted us to be very cautious about the use of it. The final source I'm giving you, which is actually the codified law, source 9, this is in the Shulchan Aruch, which is, a codification of Jewish law in the, 1530s, is it sick historian?
Printed 1565.
1565, thank you very much. So it's somewhat later than our Talmudic sources, okay? But notice what you see here. Who wants to read it out loud? Yes, thank you.
All chametz and leaven in my possession that I have not seen and or have not eliminated shall be nullified like the dust of the earth. Amen.
What's not there? What's missing? Nothing about hefker, nothing about ownerlessness. So it turned out all of the worry about the artifice associated with ownerlessness, when it was finally codified, they thought, let's not let people use this idea. Now, it's true that Ashkenazim put it back in. Not sure why. Well, we have some ideas, but that might take us far afield for tonight. But interestingly, if you have, Sephardic brethren out there, they're using the version from the Shulchan Aruch. And if you have a bunch of Ashkenazic friends, and you have some Ashken normativity in your bones, you're using the concept of ownerlessness, but you want to be very, very careful with it, because as you can see, the legal concept is really muddy. Probably the Babylonians didn't really know what they were doing with it, because all of the core sources were with the Palestinians, and they weren't paying that much attention to that source of law that we started with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Questions, thoughts, concerns? Yes.
One thing that struck me through the whole conversation is, where does, in the Jewish tradition, where does belief in the divine come into? Like, if you're in your heart of heart, you think that your intention is to destroy the chametz. However, I am not touching this. I'm not going to use it, whatever. Isn't that enough to be acceptable? That in your heart, that's what you want. I guess this is what confuses me about all this strict religion law, is like, it should be your intent and your belief, and not have to be this checklist of requirements. But I'm a bit of a
thing, and then you could say something theological. It's very interesting what you're saying, because part of the source, and Hartman knows this, about what the nullification actually is, Rashi says it's about what's in your heart. So exactly the words you use, bittul balev, is so totally sufficient. And it's actually the Tosafists who come and try to use this hefker idea, this more legalistic concept, and the Ashkenazim basically inherit the Tosafist idea. And I think basically what the Shulchan Aruch is codifying is the bittul balev, in your heart idea. So you should be Sephardic if you're not. Yes.
I'm curious. So going back to the midrashic source of the specific source of the meaning, do you feel like this legal understanding kind of cheapens the message? Because it's like
so mean.
Oh, well, make yourself ownerless, but like actually, you never really became ownerless. Like you actually are still like the observant Judy were from the get-go. So that could be like empowering, but also could be a kind of cheating of like, we don't actually encourage you to like go outside of your religious bounds. It's not actually what we're saying.
It's a good question. I don't actually know how the Hasidic understanding really jives with the
Yeah, they probably weren't so into the.
so
Linguistic
much
aspect.
necessarily in conversation with one another. But I do think the ambivalence around it is something that the Hasidic approach can understand. The fear of, well, entering into hefker, entering into a place of wilderness is both, right, a place of potential of radical openness and also a place potentially of danger. So the idea of, on the one hand, seeing it as a kind of precondition for being in the world, receiving Torah, etc., and also maybe on the other hand, right, being a little bit cautious about it, at least rhymes with some of the Talmudic approach, but I do think that they're in different discourses.
But your conversation about the legalistic aspect of hefker took us really far afield from Rabbi Erin's introductory remarks and the book, right? The Torah of at the time of plague. I assume people were not thinking about your kind of hefker when they were thinking about the hefker that you started your conversation.
It's a hard question. I mean, to me, the like learning with friends, trying to figure out what Rabbi Yossi's descent is all about, is like a kind of presence I was able to get during the pandemic, which I never have the freedom and time to actually engage in. So, I mean, it's not about hefker per se, but it's the ability to kind of dig in communion with Hoffman and with our other chavrusa that for me was the experience of the pandemic. So my chapter in that book is actually not studying. I'm just following along the Daf Yomi cycle. So I do pages Talmud a day. I started in January of 2020. March 8th of 2020 was the day that a tractate Shabbat started, the tractate about the pause that you take every week. And so I was studying that throughout the pandemic, at least the first few months of it. And that, you know, I was just at a talk earlier where a big debate is like, did you learn anything in the emergency that you can take forward? Like it almost seemed like we were close to having a universal basic income because people finally saw that there were, you know, essential workers, and we were finally like seeing how our economy was actually distributed perhaps unequally, but it looks like we're just back to regular business. We didn't really learn anything. And I think I have something that I'm keeping going forward. So I don't, for me, that, you know, it's a mode of engagement that is now accessible to me that wasn't quite as much before.
I obviously have a pretty limited understanding of Jewish law, but what I do know is that there is a clause that kind of allows you to break a law if it's to save someone's life. And so while you were talking, I was thinking about the example you presented of giving someone who's thirsty water, and how another difference between that and the artifice wedding thing is that ultimately there's not really a lot of material health benefits to the father and the son being able to dine together at the wedding, as opposed to even if your sister isn't dying, giving her water when she's thirsty has there's a very pragmatic sense of health. And I'm wondering if, obviously it's not life or death, but I wonder if that could have played into the difference between those two cases as well.
I mean, I'm assuming that they thought it was more for enjoyment rather than for something that was significant to health, because what you know about Jewish law is also something I've heard of. I think that's quite right. And I think we're used to solve the problem of the vow if that had been the real issue in that particular scenario. So
there's a question from the audience. This isn't a legal question, but what with the regard to the relation of hefker to COVID as a kind of a desert that enables new insights, do you think this is a similar to the idea of liminality in Victor Turner, if you know his idea there of places betwixt and between given social statuses?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely yes. And also particularly when Ethan presented the idea of hefker, of rendering something hefker, but then there was a 3-day period in between what you call the waiting period, I thought of as the liminal zone. Yes, absolutely. Right. So it's scholar of Victor Turner, but I am familiar with his works, and he's certainly the idea of the kind of generativity of liminal places, the generativity of kind of gateway moments is absolutely, I think, very much packed into the ideas of hefker that I presented.
It's also a fun chapter in the book, Ben Ashmashot in Tractate Shabbat, this kind of liminal space. There's like these minutes that you don't know, is it Sabbath or is it not Sabbath? And there's like lots of reflections on that in Tractate Shabbat, so you should buy the book. And, yeah.
Question for Erin, but I think also maybe Ethan.
Right, pipe up.
To your side of this. Erin, is there a minimum age at which hefker is a possible way towards, enlightenment? I mean, we've gone through this experience of COVID and pandemic and seen, I don't know, very little good for kids, right? I don't think they necessarily have the tools to see this in context, to reflect, and it seems a little inapt to say, there was some good in this for them. I mean, wouldn't it have been better not to have COVID for them? So like the whole concept, it seems like there has to be a minimum capacity. And I guess that's the same question to Ethan. With any of this stuff, is it what point is are these meaningful acts when we're talking about children? It's
in the room, I can say 100%, very closely the negative impact of the pandemic on our own children. And by no means was my presentation an attempt to watch over those details or to suggest that the pandemic was a wondrous activity or a wondrous event, that gave us into the hands of wisdom. That would be a little too simple. And I think precisely the way in which this concept kind of toggles between total mess, total chaos, anarchy, with a really negative valence, and also the idea that there is possibility there. Both of those need to be retained. And so my aim here specifically was to employ both of those concepts, meaning the very same event, killed a lot of people, made some people stronger, sure, right? But it also really killed a lot of people, and it killed lives, and it killed ways of lives, as I said before. And so this isn't an attempt to ignore that, God forbid, but actually to kind of mine the very same experience to say that what for some people, the hefkerut and the experience of the wilderness, put them at sea, and we lost so many people, literally and metaphorically. And for others, or maybe some of those same people, also found it to be a wilderness that was itself a kind of clearing. So, that I think is the beginning of a response.
And there is a question that sort of takes us to now. Has the fading of the pandemic made it harder to access the spiritual and theological? Is it fair to say possession and dispossession are legal constructs that somehow help to regulate the spiritual material dialectic?
I didn't understand that. Can you repeat that?
Let's read it again and then
So the first
meditate.
The fading of the pandemic made it harder to access the spiritual or theological. And then the second part is it fair to say possession and dispossession are legal construct that somehow help to regulate the spiritual material dialectic?
So Ethan will take part 2 and I'll take part 1, and just say that has the distance made it harder? And this is obviously so personal. The distance has made it easier in the way that perspective makes things, and time, it makes things a little bit more manageable, a little bit more, there's just room. There's a little bit of room for reflection. right? And for others, the intensity and the urgency and the profound vulnerability experienced during the pandemic was itself the fodder for tremendous spiritual openings. So yes, and right, it's obviously really, really personal. Distance for some helps, and distance for others weakens. And I think that part of what I wanted to capture in this book was just precisely, right, what does it look like in the moment? This book will, look very different if it was published now, and another volume were to come out in 3 years from now. I think that the voices would sound different. And that was the intention of this book, was to have about 22 voices, I think, of people who are just responding in their moment from their place of spiritual and theological and historical and liturgical offerings.
The only thing I would say, I thought it was a very interesting reflection about the dialectic of possession and dispossession, but it got me thinking back to one of our sources where you had the 3-day waiting period, which is that, just to go back to a prior comment from the chat, is a liminal space. And so I like the addition of the liminal space, and that it's not just a dialectic between possession and dispossession, but actually to also kind of live in that. I actually don't know what the status of this thing is. Like, I both want to dispossess it, but actually I haven't totally severed from it. And that is a productive part of the dialectic. So the problem is that the dialectic only shows us the polarity. And then the Gemara gives us a way to look at the 3-day waiting period that's not just for cheaters and thieves, but is really for everybody. So I like that as a coda. With that, thank you so much.
I want to just close with 2 reflections on this conversation. Which is one, I'm struck by this last conversation, right, about the book being sort of a time capsule, and that it would look really different if it were written today and written in 3 years. And the idea, right, like you had time to start studying the Talmud every day. And the voices that aren't captured in the book are voices of those who were busier than they usually are, because of whatever trauma they were dealing with, whether it was in the hospital or personal loss and so on, and sort of thinking about this 3-day waiting period and sort of letting those voices in also, and sort of thinking about like when things become hefker for different people at different times based on their experiences. And the second thing that strikes me is that the earliest source we saw today in the Yerushalmi and the Palestinian Talmud with hefker is about the fields. And one of the sort of most striking visual sort of like images from the pandemic, at least the early months, was like the world became hefker to humans. And so the animals came back, right? And so we had sort of a return to wildlife, and sort of thinking also about sort of what's abandoned for some or ownerless for others, and then others can take possession of it, sort of thinking like, especially this week was a big week for climate change, and the climate and the COVID conversations are really in conversation with one another. And so thinking about sort of what does it mean in a way to like give some of the land back to the animals and to wildlife in order to sort of rebuild. And so I want to like leave us maybe with that idea of thinking like of not letting the sort of changes that the pandemic allowed that were positive to sort of like return to normal, but really thinking about sort of moving forward and like what does it mean a little bit to sort of think about the world maybe as like, I don't know, ownerless, but in like that all creatures possess it in some way. So I thought maybe that's a way of tying things together. And then the last part is just that very early in the pandemic, one of the big questions was how do Jews celebrate Passover when everyone is isolated? How do Christians celebrate Easter, right? Those were like the big conversations that were happening. And so some of these questions became really live issues, right? How do you do these sorts of rituals when you're alone, like in a forest or in a wilderness? And sort of like allow us to go back to that time and think about it, and also think about sort of where we are now and then where do we want to go. So with that, I want to thank both of you and everyone for your participation and questions. And we hope that you'll come back for more conversation. So thank you.